The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, is one of the most defining conflicts in U.S. history. It reshaped the nation, ended slavery, and altered the balance of power between the federal government and individual states. Yet, despite being one of the most studied wars in history, many aspects of the Civil War remain shrouded in mystery, misconception, and oversimplification. For many, the war is often reduced to a battle between the noble North, fighting for the abolition of slavery, and the South, determined to uphold it. But was it really that simple? While slavery was undoubtedly a key factor, the war was also driven by economic rivalries, political struggles, and deep-seated cultural divisions that had been brewing for decades. What if I told you that many Southerners opposed the Confederacy? That Abraham Lincoln's primary goal was not the immediate abolition of slavery? That European powers nearly intervened in the war, and that the South came much closer to victory than most people realize? In this video, we'll explore the hidden secrets of the Civil War, debunk common myths, and reveal the lesser-known consequences that still impact America today. When people think of the American Civil War, the issue of slavery is often considered its primary cause. While slavery was undeniably at the heart of the conflict, the war was driven by a complex web of economic, political, and social factors. Understanding these deeper causes helps paint a more complete picture of why the war erupted and why it became one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Economic divide, the industrial North versus the agrarian South. By the mid-19th century, the United States was essentially two different economies coexisting within one nation. The North was rapidly industrializing, with factories, railroads, and cities expanding at an unprecedented rate. The economy in the North relied on wage labor and a growing middle class, with an emphasis on manufacturing and trade. In contrast, the South remained predominantly agricultural, built upon vast plantations that depended on enslaved labor. Cotton was the foundation of the Southern economy, sometimes called white gold due to its immense profitability. It made up more than half of U.S. exports, and its primary markets were in Europe, especially Great Britain and France. Southern elites were deeply invested in maintaining this economic model, believing that any attempt to restrict slavery threatened their financial survival. A major source of tension was the issue of tariffs. The North, seeking to protect its emerging industries, advocated for high tariffs on imported goods, making it more expensive for Americans to buy foreign products. This benefited Northern manufacturers, but hurt the South, which relied on importing goods and selling cotton internationally. Southern leaders saw these tariffs as unfair economic policies designed to enrich the North at their expense. The political struggle for power. As the U.S. expanded westward, the question arose: would new territories permit slavery or be free states? This issue was not just about moral or ethical considerations. It was about political power. The South feared that if slavery were not allowed to spread, it would eventually be abolished altogether. If more free states joined the Union, they would gain a majority in Congress, allowing them to pass laws that could threaten the Southern way of life. To maintain a balance, compromises were struck, such as the Missouri Compromise, 1820. This allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state, while Maine joined as a free state, maintaining an equal number of free and slave states in Congress. The Compromise of 1850. This introduced popular sovereignty, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. It also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring northern states to return escaped enslaved people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. This effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise by allowing settlers in new territories to determine whether slavery would be legal, leading to violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas. Political tensions reached a breaking point with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. While Lincoln did not initially call for the abolition of slavery in states where it already existed, he firmly opposed its expansion. Southern leaders viewed his presidency as a direct threat to their way of life, prompting secession. The decision by Southern states to break away from the Union and form their own government. State rights versus federal authority. The issue of state sovereignty versus federal power was another major factor leading to the Civil War. Many Southern leaders believed in the idea that states had the right to govern themselves without federal interference. They argued that, just as the American colonies had once broken away from Britain, Southern states had the right to leave the Union if they felt their rights were being violated. Northern leaders, on the other hand, saw secession as unconstitutional and believed that preserving the Union was essential for the survival of the nation. Lincoln and his supporters argued that the United States was a single, indivisible entity, and allowing states to leave would set a dangerous precedent. International influence and foreign interests. The Civil War was not just an American affair. It had significant implications for the global economy and international relations. The South hoped that Britain and France, both highly dependent on Southern cotton, would intervene on their behalf. However, this did not happen. Britain, despite its reliance on Southern cotton, had already abolished slavery in its own empire. Supporting the Confederacy would have contradicted its anti-slavery stance. Additionally, Britain and other European powers began looking to alternative sources for cotton, such as Egypt and India, reducing their dependence on the American South. France, under Napoleon III, had its own interests in North America. The French emperor saw the war as an opportunity to expand his influence, particularly in Mexico, where he installed a puppet emperor, Maximilian I. France hoped that a weakened United States would be unable to intervene, but after the North's victory, the U.S. pressured France to withdraw, leading to Maximilian's downfall. While slavery was the primary issue at the center of the Civil War, it was deeply intertwined with economic conflicts, political struggles, and questions of national identity. The North and South had fundamentally different visions for the future of the United States, and these divisions had been simmering for decades before finally boiling over into war. Understanding these underlying causes helps us see the Civil War not just as a moral struggle, but as a clash of economic interests, political power, and the very definition of what it meant to be a unified nation. Myths and unusual facts. The American Civil War is one of the most studied conflicts in history, yet many myths, misconceptions, and little-known facts surround it. Over time, certain narratives have been simplified or distorted, leaving a gap between what most people believe and what actually happened. This section explores some of the most intriguing myths and unusual facts about the Civil War, revealing a more complex and sometimes surprising reality. Myth number 1, the Civil War was only about slavery. One of the most widespread myths is that the Civil War was solely about slavery. While slavery was undoubtedly the central issue, the war was also fueled by economic, political, and regional tensions that had been building for decades. Economic divide. The North's industrial economy relied on wage labor, while the South's plantation economy was dependent on enslaved workers. The South wanted free trade with Europe, whereas the North pushed for protective tariffs to support its industries. Political power struggle. Southern states feared losing influence in Congress as more free states joined the Union. They believed that if slavery could not expand into new territories, it would eventually be abolished everywhere. State sovereignty versus federal authority. Many Southerners believed that individual states had the right to secede, just as the American colonies had once declared independence from Britain. While slavery was the primary issue at the heart of these conflicts, reducing the entire war to a simple North versus South morality tale oversimplifies the deep and complex divisions that led to war. Myth number 2. The North had a huge advantage and was destined to win. Many people assume that because the North had more people, factories, and railroads, it was always going to win. However, this was not necessarily the case. Southern military leadership. The South had some of the best military commanders of the time, including Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and J.E.B. Stuart. Their strategies and battlefield tactics allowed the Confederacy to hold out much longer than expected. Home field advantage. Most battles were fought in the South, giving Southern forces better knowledge of the terrain and supply lines. Northern troops often struggled with unfamiliar landscapes and long supply chains. Foreign interest. The Confederacy hoped that Britain or France would intervene on their behalf, given their reliance on Southern cotton. While this never materialized, the possibility kept the war's outcome uncertain for years. Had a few key battles gone differently, or had European powers recognized the Confederacy, the war might have ended with a very different result. Myth number 3. Most soldiers died in battle. When people picture the Civil War, they often imagine bloody battlefield deaths. While combat was brutal, most soldiers did not die from gunfire or bayonets. The biggest killer of the war was disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia were rampant in military camps due to poor sanitation and contaminated water. Twice as many soldiers died from disease as from battle wounds. Medical knowledge was limited, and field hospitals were often overwhelmed. Amputation was the most common surgical procedure, and infections frequently led to death. Conditions were so terrible that for many soldiers, surviving camp life was just as dangerous, if not more so, than surviving the battlefield. Unusual fact number 1, Lincoln was not the only target on the night of his assassination. Most people know that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. However, what many don't realize is that this was part of a larger conspiracy to decapitate the Union government. Booth's plan included assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward on the same night. Lewis Powell, another conspirator, attacked Seward in his home, stabbing him multiple times, but Seward miraculously survived. George Atzerodt was assigned to kill Johnson, but lost his nerve and fled without carrying out the assassination. Had the full plan succeeded, the U.S. government could have been thrown into chaos just as the war was ending. Unusual fact number 2, women fought in the Civil War disguised as men. Though women were not officially allowed to enlist, many disguised themselves as men and fought on both sides of the war. Over 400 women are known to have fought in the war, cutting their hair and adopting male identities to avoid detection. Some, like Sarah Edmonds, aka Franklin Thompson, even served as spies, using their ability to move undetected between enemy lines. Others, such as Jenny Hodgers, aka Albert Cashier, continued living as men for the rest of their lives after the war. Their bravery and determination challenged the traditional image of the Civil War soldier as exclusively male. Unusual fact number 3. The Civil War could have had a different name. The name Civil War was not universally accepted at the time. Different groups referred to the conflict in different ways. The North mostly called it the War of the Rebellion. The South often referred to it as the War between the States. Some Confederate sympathizers called it the War for Southern Independence. Even today, some historians debate what the most accurate name for the war should be, reflecting the deeply divisive nature of the conflict. Unusual fact number 4. The first U.S. income tax was introduced because of the war. To finance the war effort, the Union government introduced the first ever federal income tax in American history. In 1861, Congress passed the Revenue Act, which imposed a 3% tax on incomes over $800. This tax helped fund the Union Army and set a precedent for future taxation. Although it was abolished in 1872, it laid the foundation for the modern U.S. income tax system, which would be permanently established with the 16th Amendment in 1913. This shows how the effects of the Civil War extend far beyond just the battlefield and shaped modern America in unexpected ways. Unusual fact number 5. There was a lost colony of Americans who fled to Brazil. After the Confederacy lost the war, some diehard Southern loyalists refused to live under Union rule. Instead, they packed up their belongings and moved to Brazil, where slavery was still legal. over 10,000 former Confederates left the U.S. and established colonies in Brazil. The most famous settlement was Americana, São Paulo, where their descendants still live today. Some modern-day Brazilians of Confederate descent even celebrate their heritage with Civil War-themed festivals. This forgotten chapter of history demonstrates just how deeply some Southerners resisted the idea of Union victory. The Civil War is full of myths and little-known stories that reveal just how complex and unexpected history can be. While we often think of this conflict in simple terms, the reality is far more intricate, filled with strange events, surprising twists, and forgotten legacies that continue to shape the United States to this day. How the South could have won. Many people assume that the Civil War's outcome was inevitable, that the North, with its superior resources, was always destined to win. However, history is rarely that simple. The Confederacy had multiple opportunities to turn the tide in its favor and had certain key events played out differently. The South could have emerged victorious. This section explores the strategic, political, and military factors that could have led to a Confederate victory. 1. A more effective military strategy. One of the biggest challenges the South faced was its military strategy. Confederate leaders, particularly Robert E. Lee, often pursued an offensive strategy, launching invasions into the North instead of fighting a more defensive war. This decision, while bold, ultimately weakened the South's ability to sustain the war effort. How a defensive strategy could have changed the war of attrition. If the South had focused purely on defensive warfare, forcing the North to invade and fight in unfamiliar territory, Union forces would have suffered greater casualties over time. A prolonged war might have exhausted Northern resolve. Fortifications and strongholds. The South could have invested more in fortifying key cities and supply lines, making it even harder for Union forces to advance. Avoiding costly offensives. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, was a turning point in the war, largely because Lee led his army into Pennsylvania, far from Southern supply lines. A more conservative approach, fighting defensively in Virginia, could have saved manpower and prolonged the war. A defensive war, combined with strategic counterattacks, might have forced the North into a stalemate, increasing the likelihood of a negotiated peace. 2. Winning foreign recognition and support. One of the Confederacy's greatest hopes for victory was foreign intervention. If Britain or France had formally recognized the Confederate States of America and provided military aid, the South's chances of winning would have drastically improved. Why didn't Europe intervene? Slavery was a major stumbling block. Britain and France had already abolished slavery, and supporting the Confederacy, a nation fighting to preserve slavery, was politically unpopular. The Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, sealed the deal. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it turned the war into a clear moral battle against slavery. This made it nearly impossible for European nations to justify supporting the South. Economic factors. Britain had found alternative sources of cotton in Egypt and India, reducing its dependence on the southern cotton supply. How the South could have secured foreign aid ending slavery. Earlier, if the Confederacy had voluntarily abolished or at least phased out slavery early in the war, it might have been seen as a legitimate new nation rather than a rebellion. Diplomatic pressure. Southern diplomats such as James Mason and John Slidell were sent to Europe but had limited success. A more aggressive diplomatic effort, coupled with economic incentives, might have secured an alliance. Military victories in the North. If Lee had decisively won at Gettysburg, it might have convinced Britain or France that the Confederacy was a viable, independent nation worth backing. A well-timed foreign alliance could have changed everything, bringing in much-needed weapons, financial support, and even naval assistance against the Union blockade. 3. Breaking the Union blockade. The Union's Anaconda Plan, designed to strangle the Confederacy by blockading southern ports, was one of the most effective strategies of the war. The blockade severely limited the South's ability to trade cotton for weapons and supplies, gradually choking its economy. How the South could have overcome the blockade. More advanced naval technology. The Confederacy experimented with new naval technology, such as the ironclad CSS Virginia and early submarines like the H.L. Hunley. If the South had developed a larger fleet of ironclads or perfected submarine warfare sooner, they could have broken the blockade. Guerrilla naval tactics. The South could have used more commerce raiders like the CSS Alabama to disrupt Union shipping and force the North to divert resources. Foreign-built warships. The Confederacy ordered warships from Britain, including the Laird rams, but international pressure prevented their delivery. A more successful diplomatic effort might have secured these crucial ships. Had the South been able to keep its trade routes open, it could have sustained its war effort far longer and possibly negotiated a peace deal. 4. Targeting Northern morale. One of the most overlooked factors in the war was public opinion in the North. The longer the war dragged on, the more unpopular it became among Northern citizens. If the South had done more to break Northern morale, it might have forced Lincoln to negotiate. How the South could have weakened Northern resolve, avoiding Gettysburg, and instead striking Washington, D.C. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania in 1863 was bold, but a direct attack on Washington, D.C. could have dealt a psychological blow to the Union. Even if the city wasn't captured, it would have shocked the North and hurt Lincoln politically. More use of guerrilla warfare. Instead of fighting conventional battles, the South could have focused on irregular warfare, using hit-and-run tactics to make the war too costly for the North. Exploiting political divisions. The 1864 election was crucial. If the Confederacy had prolonged the war or inflicted enough damage, it might have helped the pro-peace Democratic candidate, George McClellan, defeat Lincoln. A McClellan presidency could have resulted in a negotiated peace. If the Northern public had grown too war-weary, the Union might have been forced to end the war on Southern terms. 5. Delaying the war's end. The Confederacy didn't necessarily need a complete victory, just survival long enough to force the North to give up. The American Revolution had shown that a weaker force, the 13 colonies, could defeat a stronger power, Great Britain, by simply outlasting their enemy's will to fight. How the South could have prolonged the war, avoiding large-scale battles that drained manpower. Instead of trying to win decisive battles, the South could have focused on small, strategic victories and drawn the war out for several more years. Using the terrain more effectively, the Confederacy had vast wilderness areas where guerrilla tactics could have made occupation impossible for the North. Winning more political support in the North. If the war had lasted into 1865 to 1866, public pressure in the North might have forced Lincoln's successor to seek a peace settlement. Had the war continued into 1866 or beyond, it's possible that the North would have lost the political will to continue fighting, leading to a negotiated independence for the Confederacy. A victory that almost was. The Confederate States of America ultimately lost the Civil War, but history shows that their defeat was not inevitable. With different strategic choices, a purely defensive war, foreign recognition, breaking the blockade, attacking Northern morale, and prolonging the conflict, the South might have secured independence. While the Union's victory reshaped America, it's fascinating to consider how small changes in strategy, diplomacy, and leadership could have led to a very different world today. The aftermath, consequences that are rarely discussed. The Civil War officially ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. However, the war's impact did not simply vanish with the final battles. The conflict left deep scars, social, economic, and political, that shaped America for generations. While most discussions focus on Reconstruction, the abolition of slavery, and the long-term unification of the United States, there are many lesser-known consequences of the war that are rarely discussed. 1. The psychological trauma of a nation. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in American history, with an estimated 750,000 deaths, more than World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. Beyond the staggering loss of life, the war left psychological scars on soldiers and civilians alike. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in Civil War veterans. Though PTSD wasn't recognized as a medical condition at the time, many veterans exhibited symptoms we now associate with it: nightmares and flashbacks of the battlefield, severe anxiety and depression, substance abuse, especially alcohol and opium, to cope with emotional distress. Some soldiers committed suicide or became social outcasts, unable to reintegrate into civilian life. Many amputees suffered not just from physical pain, but also from what we now call phantom limb syndrome, an eerie sensation of pain in a missing limb. Civilians were traumatized too. The war destroyed countless families. Women who lost husbands and children who lost fathers had to adjust to a life without financial or emotional support. Entire towns were burned, looted, and economically devastated, especially in the South. The war shattered the idea of American exceptionalism, proving that the country was not immune to internal destruction. 2. The rise of the lost cause. Myth after the war, many in the South refused to accept defeat as the end of their identity. This led to the Lost Cause movement, which sought to reinterpret the war in a way that glorified the Confederacy and minimized slavery's role. How the Lost Cause myth changed history. It rewrote the narrative of the war, claiming that the South fought for states' rights rather than to preserve slavery. Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee were portrayed as noble heroes rather than men who led a rebellion against the United States. The role of slavery was downplayed or ignored, leading to decades of misinformation in history books. Statues and monuments were erected across the South, celebrating Confederate generals and reinforcing a romanticized view of the Confederacy. This myth became deeply ingrained in Southern culture and paved the way for segregation, Jim Crow laws, and racial violence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. 3. The unpunished Confederate leaders and soldiers. One of the most surprising consequences of the war was the lack of severe punishment for Confederate leaders. Unlike many other historical conflicts where defeated leaders were executed or imprisoned for life, the U.S. government took a relatively lenient approach to the Confederacy. What happened to Confederate leaders? Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, was imprisoned for only 2 years and later released without trial. Robert E. Lee was not imprisoned at all, even though he had led the Confederate military effort. He was allowed to live peacefully in Virginia until his death. Other Confederate generals like James Longstreet and P.G.T. Beauregard were fully pardoned and even participated in politics after the war. Why weren't they punished? Lincoln's policy of reconciliation. Lincoln wanted to reunify the country as quickly as possible and believed punishing the South too harshly would only cause further division. Andrew Johnson's leniency. After Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson issued mass pardons to former Confederates, undermining efforts to hold them accountable. Fear of another rebellion. The Union government worried that executing or imprisoning Southern leaders might spark a second wave of resistance. This leniency allowed many Confederate sympathizers to maintain power, influencing Southern politics and racial policies for decades. The economic consequences. A South in ruins. While the North experienced an economic boom after the war, the South was left in complete devastation. The collapse of the Southern economy, destruction of infrastructure. Railroads, farms, and cities were completely destroyed during the war, particularly in Georgia, Virginia, and Mississippi. The Union Army's scorched earth tactics, like Sherman's march to the sea, left many areas unlivable for years. Loss of slave labor. Before the war, Southern plantations depended on enslaved labor to sustain their economy. With the abolition of slavery, Many plantation owners found themselves without a workforce and without money to pay freed black workers. Hyperinflation and bankruptcy. Confederate money became worthless overnight, leaving many Southern families destitute. The South's banking system collapsed, and recovery took decades. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the South economically recovered and began to modernize. 5. The unresolved racial tensions and rise of Jim Crow. Many people assume that the end of the Civil War meant immediate freedom and equality for African Americans. While slavery was abolished, true equality was still far out of reach. How the South restricted black freedom after the war. Black Codes, 1865 to 1866. Southern states quickly passed laws that severely limited the rights of freed black people. These laws restricted their ability to vote, banned them from owning certain types of property, made it illegal for black people to be unemployed, which forced many into near-slavery conditions on plantations. Rise of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. The KKK and other white supremacist groups emerged in the late 1860s, using terrorism and violence to maintain white dominance. Segregation becomes law. In the late 19th century, Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing strict racial segregation in schools, public transportation, and businesses. The Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, Supreme Court ruling upheld segregation, making it legal until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Even though the Union won the war, racial injustice continued for another century, showing how deeply ingrained the consequences of the war were. A war that never truly ended. The American Civil War officially ended in 1865, but its effects have echoed through history for generations. The war may have settled the question of secession, but it did not immediately resolve the deep divisions within the country. The battlefields fell silent, but the struggles over race, politics, and economic power continued long after. Even today, the war's legacy still influences American society. The debate over Confederate monuments, the lingering effects of Reconstruction policies, and ongoing racial tensions all stem from unresolved issues of the past. The myths that emerged after the war, such as the lost cause narrative, have shaped how history is remembered and taught, sometimes distorting the reality of what truly happened. Had the Reconstruction period been handled differently, with stronger protections for freed Black Americans, harsher consequences for Confederate leaders, and a more unified national rebuilding effort, the United States might have taken a different path. Instead, compromises and political decisions allowed old divisions to fester, leading to a century of segregation, racial violence, and economic disparity in the South. The Civil War was not just a battle between North and South. It was a battle over the very identity of the United States. Would it be a nation truly built on freedom and equality, or one that continued to be shaped by oppression and division? That question, in many ways, is still being answered today. The war may be over, but its impact has never truly faded. The lessons of the past remain relevant, reminding us that history is not just something to be remembered. It is something to be understood, questioned, and learned from. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, consider subscribing for more in-depth historical analysis. History is more than just dates and battles. It's a story that continues to shape our world.